Welcome all, Dr. JC here, part 2 of Rome. We're going to move from those Punic Wars we discussed in part 1. The Punic Wars, again, are those wars fought between Rome and Carthage. And we're going to take a look at changes in Roman society, not so much just the social structure, but the way people viewed Roman governance. And we're also going to take a look at some changes in Roman leadership, military leadership specifically, to who or whom should an individual swear their allegiance, to Rome the state or maybe Roman generals now. And then we're going to also conclude this lecture of part 2 taking a peek at this move from this period of republic toward empire, most specifically this period known as the First Triumvirate. So we'll pick up here with changes in Roman society first. In the wake of these Punic Wars, Rome's leaders really had some decisions to make. Now, all civilizations, all societies, all nation states at some point, especially their elected officials, have to weigh foreign and domestic policy. There's only so many dollars to go around, and if you're spending more money on the military, building ships, expanding legions, then you have less to build bridges at home and maybe deal with the urban poor. Regarding the latter, the poor, increasingly more and more Roman citizens were falling on hard times, being squeezed out of former opportunities, and being left to sit on a corner with a cup and beg for help. This was a problem. Rome had always had a segment of its plebeian population that was among the poor. All societies do. But this number of poor exploded in the post-Punic War period for several reasons. First, the elite, who had suffered a great deal when Hannibal was on the peninsula, it was their farms and their fields that were asked to be burned as part of this Fabian strategy. And now that the war was over, they're looking for some favorable legislation to reclaim these lands, to reclaim some losses, and they will get that. So in addition to these wealthy landowners expanding their holdings, wealthy speculators will do the same thing, all the while driving off small farmers from their fields. So as small farmers and peasants are being driven off their land, some of which they owned, their options for other employment were minimal. The second point as it relates to the explosion of this urban poor deals specifically with that displacement of peasants and smaller farmers. It was hard for peasants who were unskilled laborers to find work in the city. And for those former individuals that owned land, they didn't have an opportunity to go in the military anymore either. They couldn't. It's worth noting briefly here that Rome's legions to this point were comprised of individuals who could meet property requirements. It's not like Rome was out just recruiting any average everyday Joe. Not the case. Rather, you had to be from the propertied class to be part of Rome's legions. And the reason they did that is because individuals then were wed to the state rather than any specific general per se. They had a vested interest in fighting hard because they were defending their own property and lands. That's just the way the army was made up. So when these landowners are displaced from their farms, they can't meet property requirements to potentially go in the military now. They too are driven into this poverty class. As a way to try to deal with this growing urban poor problem, enter reformers like Tiberius and his younger brother Gaius Gracchus. Among the many reforms pushed by individuals like Tiberius Gracchus, Tiberius himself was actually a veteran of the Third Punic War, were land reform. These land reforms, or agrarian reforms as they would have been known to the Romans, were really pretty radical. They called for the state to either seize or transfer lands owned by wealthy people and be given to poorer people. It was really a redistribution of wealth and property here, which by any stretch of the imagination and in any age is pretty radical to be sure. As you may imagine, with many Roman senators themselves being among the wealthy class, they stood to lose here. Therefore, Tiberius's message and those of other quote-unquote reformers were to be dealt with. It was determined by more conservative senators in the Roman Senate. They were known as the Optimates, that Tiberius had to be dealt with. Sorry, he did. And the best way to deal with a political opponent in the ancient Roman world is to not spread quote-unquote fake news about him. You just frickin' kill him. And that's exactly what will be happen to Tiberius himself. He's gonna be offed. Now, I mentioned in the Greek lesson the definition of insanity was doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Well, Gaius Gracchus is going to follow his brother Tiberius. He comes into the Roman Senate about 10 years after Tiberius, introduces the same legislation. Guess what happens to him? Yep, he's dead too. Don't mess with the wealthy landowners in Rome. So the Roman Senate is not going to necessarily pass legislation to deal with the poor. How do you deal with them? Well, enter Marius and military changes. Because Marius was both a Roman general and a politician, a statesman, he recognized that we could solve a major problem in the military here if we change the way we do things as it relates to recruitment. Because Rome's legions, and those individuals in the legions only come from property classes, had been decimated from years and years of campaigning, they had a manpower shortage. So Marius says, look, why don't we just deal with this urban and rural poor problem we have by recruiting from these individuals? That way we can add to the ranks of Rome's legions and alleviate the poor problem at the same time. This is a friggin' no-brainer. Let's do it. Marius will gain approval for the plan, and it'll work accordingly. Generals will begin to refill their ranks with urban and rural poor, and the number of poor people in Rome will go down. Everything looks great on the surface. Yet over time, and with our historical hindsight today, we can see the problems associated with this change made by Marius. No longer would Rome's legionnaires be peopled by individuals who had property. These were individuals from what we might call the bottom rail of society. These were individuals that didn't have a lot of means, could be easily bought. And therefore, what would happen over time is Rome's generals would get recruits to swear allegiance to them rather than the Roman state. As an example of this problem, we can introduce Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Sulla, for reasons we won't get into here because they're too complex, those interested, I'd ask you Google it. Sulla will convince his legionnaires, those within his armies, to swear allegiance to him, and Sulla will use these legions to march on Rome itself. Sulla's decision to march Rome's legions on Rome itself is like as big a no-no as you can get, right? This is a mutiny. But for Sulla, he saw it as a way to save the Republic because he felt like Marius was gaining too much power. He was becoming an emperor. Thus Sulla, once he defeats Marius, and he will institute this dictatorship, and under this dictatorship he's going to call for a purge, the killing of all Marius bobbleheads in the Senate, so that individuals with some degree of virtue can be restored to the Senate and power turned back over to the Senate to save the Republic. Sulla will do this. Yet despite the best of intentions Sulla had here, what precedent did he set for future Romans? That if you don't like the current state of leadership, you just go ahead and march Rome's legions on Rome itself to force change? That's a little crazy, but that's the new standard here. And this is what we see happen as we move from this period of republic to the period of empire. To conclude this second part of Rome, I wanted to talk real briefly about this loose alliance between Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, these three together known as the First Triumvirate. Well, we could easily spend an entire week talking about the politics behind this First Triumvirate. For all intents and purposes, it was a loose alliance set up between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus to try to break the stranglehold of power that the Roman Senate had over the Roman people, upper class and lower class. They were starting to march to the tune of their own drums rather than all of Rome, and these guys looked to want to try to break that. The problem with trying to break the stranglehold of the Roman Senate is that each one of these three guys was suspicious of one another, jealous of one another. Pompey was a known military leader. He helped put down this dude named Spartacus in this Third Servile War. We'll talk about that later. Julius Caesar was very popular amongst the average everyday Roman citizens, those populares as they were known. And Crassus, he was just the richest dude in Rome. The Roman Senate wasn't in the dark. They recognized what was going on here. They knew these three cats were out to try to chisel away at their power structure, but there really wasn't much they could do about it. Crassus, they knew, was the key to this triumvirate. He was the level-headed guy. Caesar and Pompey couldn't stand one another. And as long as Crassus was in play, it made it a little difficult to break this triumvirate up. The Senate's going to catch a break, however, when Crassus is killed in battle. Immediately upon hearing news of Crassus's death, Pompey buddies up with the folks in the Roman Senate, sets up a partnership there, and now they're going to begin to target Julius Caesar. The Senate then in turn sends a note to Caesar saying, "Thank you very much for your service. It's not required anymore. I know you're up there with the legions in Gaul, modern-day France. We're going to ask that you lay down your arms and come on back to Rome, bro." Caesar recognizes what's going on here. He wasn't born yesterday. He knows that if he leaves command of the army, he loses any and all immunity. Therefore, political opponents of him, which there are many, to include Pompey himself, can bring up trumped-up charges against him, and the guy's basically hosed. So Caesar's got a decision to make. I either go back to Rome and face what likely is going to be some trumped-up charges against me, or I do the unthinkable, ask my men to basically pull a Sulla. After some discussion and receiving reassurances from his subordinate commanders of the 13th Roman Legion, Caesar decides, you know what, it's frickin' go time, man. We're going to cross this Rubicon and we're going to march on Rome. A civil war now ensues. The Roman Senate sends out Pompey to deal with Caesar. He will meet him on the battlefield and be defeated by Caesar. Caesar has an open door into Rome itself, and he will institute a dictatorship, just like Sulla. Rather than purge the Senate like Sulla did, Caesar recognizes that type of action might irritate folks that already like me. Rather, what I'm going to do is further endear the average everyday Roman citizen and military veteran to me by pushing through a series of governmental and social reforms. He's going to do that. So successful was this program of reforms, such as land reform, offering aid to veterans, offering citizenship to individuals in faraway reaches of the Roman Empire. So successful was this that the individuals across Rome declared him dictator in perpetuity. He was dictator for life. Curiously now, it's the Senate that sees Caesar as the real threat to Rome. That this guy, now that he's been named dictator for life, this stuff could go to his head. As Lord Acton would later say, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Julius Caesar has absolute power right now. This dude needs to go. The Roman Senate decides that we are just going to end this guy. And on March 15th, 44 BC, beware the Ides of March, Caesar is going to be assassinated. With Caesar's assassination, fellow senators and citizens alike lost faith in this constitutional government of the Republic. It was never going to be fully restored again, and a series of civil wars is going to break out. Who's going to potentially be the next Caesar? And in part 3 ahead, we'll talk about these civil wars, Caesar's adopted heir Octavian, and eventual rise of Octavian to become Augustus, Emperor of Rome.